Uh, Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you may happen to be in the world. My name is Mike Gomez, and I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Africa and the African Diaspora here at New York University. I am pleased to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Aligning African Worlds, Climate Change, and the Global South. Before I continue on, I want to thank Ms. Cherise Taylor, the CSOT administrator, for organizing the panel. We have with us three very distinguished panelists, and we are going to discuss, or we have about an hour and a half, about 90 minutes to discuss the various contours and parameters of the question of climate change as it pertains to the global South. I imagine that this will more specifically address this question with respect to the continent of Africa and the Caribbean, Latin America. So welcome to one and all. I will introduce the speakers in alphabetical order. They will then have approximately 15 minutes to make their presentations, after which we'll have a conversation among the three panelists with respect to the various aspects, issues that emerge from the conversation, and then we will open it up to the participants. So to begin, I want to alert you to the fact that our panelists are located in different parts of the world. And so we want to be cognizant of that as we move forward. And so we begin with an introduction of Dr. Nnimmo Bassey, who I believe is in Abuja, Nigeria, as we speak. Dr. Bassey's tireless work with national, international organizations has turned him into one of Africa's leading advocates and campaigners for the environment and human rights. Dr. Bassey has stood up against the practices of multinational corporations in his country and the environmental devastation they leave behind, destroying the lives and ignoring the rights of the local population. In 1993, he co-founded Environmental Rights Action, ERA, a Nigerian advocacy NGO, to deal with environmental human rights issues. Dr. Bassey was ERA's executive director for 2 decades and is still the chair of its management board. Dr. Bassey qualified as an architect and practiced in the public sector for 10 years. He became active in human rights issues in the 1980s as a member of the board of directors of Nigeria's Civil Liberties Organization, Environmental Rights Action, which Dr. Bassey co-founded, which is also known as Friends of the Earth Nigeria, and is the national chapter of Friends of the Earth International, the world's largest grassroots environmental network. From 2008 to 2012, Dr. Bassey served as chair of Friends of the Earth International. Dr. Bassey, welcome to you. Following Dr. Bassey, we will have Ms. Patricia Mbote, who is the director of the Law Division of the United Nations Environment Program. Previously, Ms. Mbote was founding research director of the International Environmental Law Research Center and was the program director for Africa for over 20 years. Ms. Mbote has in-depth knowledge and experience in environmental law acquired at local, national, regional, and international levels. She has consulted for the United Nations Environment Program in the review of programs, legal instruments, and the rules of engagement of major groups. She has been engaged in the Montevideo Environmental Law Program since 2007 and is a member of the governing board of the International Council on Environmental Law. Ms. Mbote is a member of the Senior Council Bar in Kenya and has been a professor of law at the School of Law, University of Nairobi, where she has taught for over 30 years and served as dean. She has also taught environmental law at Kansas University, University of Zimbabwe, and Stellenbosch University. She has served as chair of the Association of Environmental Law Lecturers at African Universities and has contributed to the development of similar initiatives for North Africa and the Middle East and for judges. Ms. Mbote, welcome to you from Nairobi. Last but not least, we have Dr. Ulrich Trotz, a scientist by training who commenced his university education in Edinburgh and attained his doctorate in organic chemistry in Toronto, Canada. His career experiences and achievements are wide and varied. As a matter of fact, I was just reading an article of his this morning. He has worked as director in the Science and Technology Division, the Commonwealth Secretariat, from 1993 to 1997. He has been the Secretary of the Commonwealth Science Council and Science Advisor to the Commonwealth Secretary General from 1991 to 1997, Secretary General, National Science Research Council in Guyana from 1979 to 1991. I'm sorry, Dr. Trotz, I don't want to put you in the 18th century. He was the Dean of the Faculty of Natural Sciences at the University of Guyana from 1976 to 1979, and the Director of the Institute of Applied Sciences and Technology in Guyana from 1980 to 1991. Since 1997, Dr. Trotz, in his capacity as manager for the GEF-funded CPACC and MACC, he can explain those acronyms, projects, has been giving direction to the region's efforts to build capacity for climate change adaptation. Dr. Trotz was review editor for Chapter 16 on SIDS in the 4th assessment report of the IPCC. He has presented several papers or lectures at a range of regional and international fora on climate change issues. Dr. Trotz now holds the post of Deputy Director and Science Advisor in the recently established Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. Welcome to you, Dr. Trotz. I'm not quite sure where you are. I think you're in Guyana somewhere. You're in Belize. He's in Belize. Yes. Thank you so much. All right. So that concludes my very brief introductions. These introductions, of course, do not do justice to the scope and breadth of the accomplishments of our esteemed panelists. So I want to turn things over to Dr. Bassey at this moment. Dr. Bassey.
Thank you very much, Michael. And such a privilege to be on this very important panel today. I was going to say this afternoon, but I know it's morning or evening somewhere in the world. Thank you so much. And I'll be speaking on a rather wide topic, climate change and the global south. I think that is very broad, but many of my examples will be from Africa, because obviously I live in Africa. The issue of climate change and the continent is very pertinent right now because of, one, the position of Africa in the world. We are right at the center of the world, and the equator cuts across a whole big chunk of the continent. So in terms of temperature differences for us on the continent of Africa, it's been documented and shown by scientists that we experience about 50% temperatures above the global average. And so this has very direct implication for climate discussions on the concerning the continent. I'll be sharing some slides so to help me keep to time, so that I don't get lost somewhere. Now, when we talk about climate impacts on the continent, my mind always, first of all, goes to the root of environmental harms on the continent, because the continent has been the focus of exploitation by various forces around the world, perhaps also because of the location of the continent on the globe. be surrounded totally by water. It could be approached from almost any direction. But apart from that kind of exploitation, we have entrenched inequalities, and this has implications for how climate change affects various people and societies. And then the issue about the global imaginary about what is important, the elevation of capital above the social conditions of humans has led to the creation of certain concepts like environmental services, and also the focus on market environmentalism, where everything is traded, nature herself is traded. And all this adds to the impact of actions that are being taken and how they affect climate, as well as resilience of humans on the continent, in the global south generally, to climate change. We also, I mentioned already about it, externalization of cost of resource extraction. And the other challenge we have generally is that the transnational corporations, who are the major drivers of extractivism in the global south, do this with the support of military forces, either of the countries where they operate or some transnational military forces that invade nations, destroy infrastructure, but secure secure access to resources. And this is very well known. Then the climate change conference of parties that were just held in Glasgow, England, brought up a very important brought up so many issues that we should consider at this conversation. The most, I would say, interesting part of it, or disappointing part of it, was on the closing day when India brought in the modified the text of the Glasgow Climate Pact to, instead of phasing out coal, recommended the phasing down of coal. That was very interesting. And I personally never heard of phase down before. I thought it was always phased out. Whatever. And so the outcome of this party is consolidate the idea to some of us that the conference of parties would not, but rather could have
I'm sorry, it looks like we've lost Dr. Bassey. Dr. Bassey, we're having some difficulties with your connection. Could you restate you were talking about the COP26. Could you restate that, please? Talking about India's introduction of changing the language from phase out to phase down. Could you start from that point again?
Right, I'm having difficulties, as you rightly said, with my connection. I've changed to another service. This happens all the time. Before webinar started, everything works perfectly, but once it starts, then the problem comes in, almost like sabotage. And so I'm going to go back to that slide and continue from where I was. And the fact that at the close of the COP26, India modified the Glasgow Agreement or Glasgow Climate Pact by suggesting that coal be phased out, but should be phased down. in Copenhagen. There's been mandatory binding emission reduction in the Paris Agreement, and which led to what is now called the national determining contribution. Emissions much more deeper than others, and the ground, which is unequal and are expected to take almost as much action as anyone else. This is very unjust because the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was built as, and that concept of justice was captured. But now, that is more or less, manner of speaking, is that being played out in fact, in reality. And so the nationally determined contributions by different nations are supposed to be submitted and then reviewed every 5 years. And this year, this nation reviewed what they had said they would do. And don't forget, the target temperature increase globally was 1.5 degrees, and then well below 2 degrees. I have my issues with those figures, but focus on Africa and the fact that Africa suffers about 50% above global average. The world agreed on an average temperature increase of 1.5. It means already that for Africa, we're talking about a possibility of temperature increase that will already be above 2 degrees. The minimum target for Africa is well above 2. And so this is really a regime of an engineered crisis that is foisted on the continent just because certain territories and regions don't want to take action that they ought to take to tackle global warming. So that's a big problem. At the COP26, when the national determined contributions from different nations were considered, it was said initially that the world, if those things are done, then the world will be heading for 2.7 degrees. During the meeting, it's a other nation brought in new pledges, and that was moderated to 2.4. But for Africa, that would mean 3.6, and that is extremely alarming. Already, Africa and countries in the global south are suffering a lot of climate impacts. A place like Mozambique in 2019 had a very unusual cyclone Idai, which took the lives of 1,000 people, destroyed infrastructure worth $2 billion. And it was said that this intensity of cyclone can be expected. Further cyclones can be expected because the temperature of the sixth report of the IPCC, this showed that Africa, for the ocean around Africa generally are getting warmer than before, and sea level rise is set to continue and not reduce, especially for Africa. And so that report could be said to be code red that was said to be code red for humanity. But we did see the issue being taken so seriously at the conference at which the climate change issues were negotiated. And the only thing mentioned about fossil fuel was that there should be a phase out of inefficient subsidies to fossil fuel. But you know, that sounded interesting, but really phasing out subsidies is not what is needed. What is needed is rapid transition from fossil fuel addiction, because the impact of climate change on the global south demands that this should be done as quickly as possible, maybe in a managed way, with those who are polluted, who have taken up 80% of the climate budget, doing far more than those who have not contributed much. For African continent has not contributed up to 3% of the stock of carbon in the atmosphere. And so that is one of the considerations that we take in when we look at the impacts of global warming in the global south. Now, coming back to Africa, Africa is having multiple crises, multiple problems. Increased desertification, increased acidification of the water bodies around the continent. We're having loss of land around in some places up to 2 meters every year along the coastline by sea level rise and coastal erosion. We're expecting to have more droughts and more floods. So everything negative from this phenomenon is expecting to hit the global south, with small island states going under the waters. And of course, all the challenges on agriculture and health issues, all of these are going to be much more pronounced in the global south. Another issue that was being discussed at the COP was the issue of loss and damage, which is the mechanisms and the approaches are yet to be agreed, although at Glasgow it was agreed that this should be taken seriously, so to speak. But the issue of loss and damage should have taken center stage in the negotiation, because the impacts are not being delayed. The impacts are getting more intense now by each passing year. And the one other issue that was very pronounced at the Conference of Parties was the issue of pledges to cut emissions formulated as attaining net zero. The European Union said they will attain net zero by 2050. Many countries use the same target date. Nigeria proposed to achieve net zero carbon emissions in 2060, and India proposed to do the same in 2070. Now, what all this means, whether by nations in the global south or the global north, is that real climate action would not be taken in the near future. And this is why we see that this will intensify carbon trading and all kinds of carbon offsetting proposals, where those who are not polluting as much as they ought to, which sounds very funny, could sell carbon credits to those who are polluting too much already. And then there was this continual reference to the fact that technology will solve the problem. And the technology that always comes to mind when you hear about this is that there's going to be more of geoengineering. And geoengineering is really a big challenge it's an issue that will create more problems for the global south, because the technology and the control of this scenario would be handled by already the rich industrialized nations. And we do understand that if that happens, the negative impacts which are bound to follow the procedures will also be borne by the vulnerable nations. So we're seeing a situation where the global south is forced to bear the brunt of climate action. They're also forced to bear the brunt of climate impacts. And rather than building resilience, building adaptation in a way that's commensurate to the problem that is coming, we're seeing less and less capacity to do this because of various factors that are aligned against the global south. Geoengineering is really something, I believe many of the participants are aware of this, but it's basically about solar radiation management or direct carbon capture and storage. Now, carbon capture and storage is a proposition that sounds interesting, sounds possible, but we do know that this is not proven, that it could capture as much carbon out of the atmosphere as needs to be captured. Now, with a less than 20% carbon budget in the atmosphere, the sensible thing should be to stop emitting more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. But to continue to emit, believe we can capture, to store, is really very audacious and in the wrong direction. There are also proposals to genetically engineer trees to either have white leaves to bring about the albedo effect or reflecting more radiation to the atmosphere, or to be more green and have higher efficiency in terms of photosynthesis and thereby grabbing more carbon out of the atmosphere. There are also proposals to seed the clouds or to whiten the clouds to reflect more radiation to the atmosphere, or generally to capture and then store in rock formations or some other construction somewhere, either beneath the ocean or in rock somewhere. And all this would give those who are proposing them the planetary thermostat, and they can actually switch on or switch off what happens in any part of the world. And we can clearly see that the negative impact would be on the less powerful regions of the world. And this is something that should not be promoted. Now, there have been solutions that have been proposed from the Global South. One is proposed by All Watch International, that real climate action would be to create annex zero countries and territories and nations. In other words, nations and territories who agree to keep fossils in the ground should be recognized as real climate actors, because then you don't need to bring the carbon out and then start struggling to capture the carbon to store somewhere else. During the COP at Glasgow, some countries signed a pledge that they're going to go beyond oil and gas. They call it Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. But you know, that again, that was very interesting. So we see a nation like France also signing up and in fact leading that move. But corporations from that region, from France, like Total, is still all over Africa, drilling for oil, looking for gas, and not paying attention to what the home country is saying they want to do. And so we're asking for real zero, not net zero. There's also the demand for a payment of climate debt, something accumulated over the centuries of pollution, of exploitation, and keeping in mind that climate finance is not forthcoming from the multilateral system because rich nations are unwilling. At Copenhagen, they agreed to put on the table $10 billion up to 2020 when they were to ramp that up to $100 billion. But up to now, rich countries are not willing or ready to put the money on the table. We recognize the fact that it's not for lack of finances, it's just lack of readiness to support climate action. We're also calling for just transition, where workers will not lose jobs, but we train to take on the new skills and new processes that are needed to cool the planet, to keep us in a manageable situation. And one of the big ideas coming from the Global South, and which is also found with small-scale farmers in the Global North, is the adoption of agroecology as the way to feed the world. Agroecology builds healthy soils, works in line with nature, and helps to cool the planet. Many small-scale farmers are already working on this technology. We're using this idea. It's not a romantic idea. It's actually scientific, and it's also something that would find wide application across the whole world. So the solutions are there, and we don't need to keep shifting the impacts on poor countries, on the Global South. There are a lot of false solutions being produced or being presented, but we need to get to the real solutions. Stop deforestation, go beyond energy efficiency, change the energy modes, shift from fossil fuels to energy basis to renewable energy, shift from industrial agriculture, which is really destructive to the soil and to the climate, to agroecology, less consumption, let's have more durable goods. And of course, keep all this in the ground, keep the fossils in the ground. These are the ideas I thought I should share at this time. And I thank everyone for their attention and for the time that I've had to share.
Thank you, Dr. Bassey. That was fascinating, and I'm looking forward to coming back to your ideas. Thank you so much. Ms. Mbote.
I'm also going to be speaking broadly on the issue of climate change and the Global South, but zeroing in quite a bit on examples from Africa. Thank you very much to the New York University Center for the Study of Africa and the African Diaspora for the invitation to speak at this event. I am speaking to you from the United Nations Environment Programme at our global headquarters in Nairobi. This is the only entity in the United Nations family that has its headquarters in the Global South and in Africa. And that is an important point because we are turning 50 next year. And as we reflect on what has happened, it's important to just see how far we have come since 1972. Earlier this month, as Dr. Nnimmo said, in Glasgow, there was the climate COP, the Conference of the Parties meeting, and the international community there took decisions which come in what many now are calling a make or break time, especially for the African continent and the Global South. And one might ask on a balance, and Dr. Bassey has talked a lot about the kinds of decisions and considerations that were had. How did they do? If we take a positive interpretation, the final agreement keeps the most important objective of the Paris Agreement within our grasp. And this is the objective of limiting global temperature rises to well below 2 degrees Celsius, and preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius. This was not achieved in Glasgow, and the agreement merely keeps the window open by reinforcing these targets and creating spaces for countries to come back to the table next year. But the overarching acknowledgement of the criticality and centrality of this temperature target is there. And that is important and needs to stay on. We also saw in Glasgow important pledges moving us closer to ending coal and fossil fuel subsidies. And I think even as the agreement changed from phase out to phase down, there is a silver lining in the sense that this is probably the very first time these issues were on the table. So we came close to ending coal and fossil fuel subsidies, pledges on limiting deforestation, pledges on limiting methane, and after long delays, agreement on the Paris Rulebook, the Article 6 framework under which the international carbon markets can now operate. But actually, pledges and promises are just words until they are implemented. And although there is now some progress on this, the delays in mobilizing the 100 billion a year pledge by 2020 in climate finance from developed to developing countries is a case in point. Pledges and promises must translate into action, because without action, there is a credibility gap. Without action, we undermine the fabric of the multilateral system. Without action, we compromise the propensity of Africa and the global South and the need to move to a low carbon and climate resilient future. Let me now focus in on Africa and the impact of climate change. Climate change significantly disrupts developmental aspirations such as poverty reduction, job creation, and inclusive and equitable macroeconomic growth. It contributes to tensions and instabilities. And for these reasons, adaptation is a key priority area for policymakers in Africa. Policymakers want to put in place systems and structures to take full advantage of global mechanisms in support of climate change mitigation and adaptation. The impacts of climate change on African countries are proportionally greater than the country's ability to adapt, because the countries have other problems that they're dealing with, which affect their steadiness and resilience. For instance, droughts, floods, and diseases have historically been a big burden for many African countries. And many of the economies are also very reliant on climate-sensitive sectors. And this is why many people say that climate change is a threat amplifier. If the world crosses the safe target of 1.5 degrees Celsius, the science tells us that Africa could approach catastrophic levels of up to 3 degrees Celsius. This paints an alarming picture. And that picture could be of the 257 million people experiencing hunger, over 12 million young people who need jobs every year that remain disenfranchised in unemployment. And of course, that has other ramifications, because that is usually the space where you have the recruitment for radicalization, because people are disenfranchised. It could also be the up to 60 million undernourished or malnourished children. The surge in vector-borne diseases like malaria could also be something else, as well as increasing flood risks which devastate communities and divert billions of dollars of already limited resources. And on top of all this, the COVID-19 global pandemic is added to the equation of climate change stressors. This means that Africa's pace to build resilience must exceed the global average if we're going to stand a fighting chance. Already, the continent has taken steps to demonstrate this urgency. For example, the region was among the first in finalizing nationally determined contributions commitments. Up to 98% of countries in Africa have finalized their first round of nationally determined contributions that are now being built upon, which makes Africa the continent with the highest compliance rate. There are many opportunities for climate mitigation and adaptation, including finance for sustainable development and green growth. However, in order to access these opportunities, countries need to adopt country-driven approaches that are supported by the multilateral regime, but more importantly, based on domestic priorities, possibilities, and capabilities. Many countries still have gaps and barriers in their legal and institutional frameworks, which limit their ability to effectively implement climate policy. Consequently, a number of African countries have developed or are in the process of developing dedicated climate change laws or amending existing laws to take into account climate change considerations. Most of these initiatives build on existing climate policies and the nationally determined contributions developed in accordance with the Paris Agreement. One of the more notable developments in climate legislation is climate change legislation. Many countries are now putting in place climate change laws. Kenya has a climate change act promulgated in 2016. And in 2016, also Zambia amended its constitution to impose a duty on the state to establish and implement mechanisms that address climate change. Uganda's Climate Change Act was enacted in 2021, and South Africa and Nigeria both have developed climate change bills, which are currently under review. Further, the Rwandan law on the environment passed in 2018 contains specific provisions on climate change. What is important is for governments to be proactive in creating legislative frameworks that can allow them to access opportunities created by the international regime for climate change, as well as to undertake voluntary commitments that are cost-effective and successful. Many African countries have plural legal systems where more than one order of law operates. So there's Kashmir law, there is state statute law, there are constitutions, and there is religious laws. The norms, actors, and structures in these different systems have something to contribute in a field as ubiquitous as climate change. And this calls for moving from a narrow definition of science and law that excludes some ways of knowing and some actors. In this direction of drawing from a wider pool of nodes, we can find inspirations from the Faith for Earth initiative. Faith actors can play an important role through providing a moral voice to the climate change crisis. Combining spiritual ethics with climate knowledge and science can serve to drive behavioral change amongst adherents more than either one can alone. Substantial and widespread changes in public attitudes are essential to tackle climate change. Given that faith permeates all areas of life, authoritative faith voices can be strong drivers in motivating people for action. UNEP's Faith for Earth initiative was founded to accelerate and solidify this spirit of interfaith collaboration, ensuring that faith actors have a voice at the highest level of environmental governance and greater access to the United Nations system. As a testament to the growing faith engagement, in October 2021, in the lead up to the meeting in Glasgow, COP26, more than 40 faith leaders from 10 religions met at the Vatican and submitted a faith appeal to the president of COP26, linking faith to science and calling upon nations to increase their ambitions and commit their organizations to take actions to reduce their carbon footprints. What key elements should legislators then consider while drafting climate change laws within this context, post the Glasgow COP26? Firstly, they should complement adaptation with mitigation. Article 7.1 of the Paris Climate Change Agreement is a stark reminder that to be adequate, the level of adaptation efforts must be at pace with the damage caused by emission. Secondly, turning to NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, these should be converted into investment plans. Africa and the other developing regions need more than $17 billion to adapt to the changing climate. As glaring as this gap is, Africa already invests in adaptation at the rate of 2% of GDP each year. But the big question is how the region can maximize these investments for impact among the most vulnerable. The answer is by turning policy commitments such as the nationally determined contributions into investment plans that attract implementation investments. Thirdly, we should engage the youth, women, and the informal sector in the implementation of climate change policies, plans, and laws. Fourthly, we should utilize local governance structures and norms that support climate change adaptation. Institutionally, the establishment of a high-level cross-sectoral climate change coordinating institution domiciled in the Office of High Authority is beneficial to oversight functions. And some countries place this office, for instance, in the Prime Minister's office or in the President's office. Such institutions offer general policy guidance supported at lower levels by an advisory panel of experts and a technical administrative secretariat. Procedures to ensure clear coordination between the central and devolved government should be clearly outlined. Fifthly, we should embrace and use data for policy. Africa does not lack in pro-adaptation policies. The most significant gap is in a lack of implementation of policy provisions already in place. The reason is that these policies lack the much needed empirical data from the ground to inform more targeted incentives that capitalize on areas that have proven as workable and effective. As you can see, ladies and gentlemen, the situation is clear. Climate change is a devastating threat for Africa and the global South. But as I have tried to show, there are also opportunities and examples where Africa is accelerating action towards a low carbon and climate resilient future, including in creating strong and implementable climate change laws. I thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mbote. It's very interesting, very useful information, and I look forward to engaging you in subsequent conversation. Following the presentation of Dr. Trotz. Dr. Trotz, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks NYU for this opportunity to share some information with you on the climate change in the Caribbean region. When I say the Caribbean region, I'm speaking about CARICOM, the Caribbean Community, which is an intergovernmental organization of 15 member states, 14 nation states and 1 dependency. Of these, 12 of them are small island development states, and 3 of them are coastal states, Belize in Central America, and Guyana and Suriname on the northern coast of South America. And like all small island developing states and low-lying coastal states, as the coastal states are, the region is regarded as highly vulnerable to climate change, and indeed is, given our experiences, the current climate in the region. In the Caribbean, we are already suffering from the impacts of a changing climate, changed weather patterns, increased frequency of extreme events, droughts and floods, increased intensity of storms, rise in sea level and sea surface temperatures, and collectively, These have had very negative impacts on the region's agriculture, water, health, and tourism sectors, and on the infrastructure in coastal areas where most of the region's population resides, and on its marine environment. Ultimately, these impacts result in loss of life and livelihoods. Ever since the international community commenced discussion on climate change issue, Caribbean countries have successfully argued for equal emphasis on adaptation and mitigation. We realize that we're living in a world already committed to climate change, and despite the rate of mitigation, we would be faced with the climate risk arising from the carbon already in the atmosphere. Adaptation is an imperative, and over the history of the international negotiations, the region has been leading advocates for the provision of resources for adaptation. At COP in Copenhagen in 2009, the region espoused the call for 1.5 to stay alive, as we felt that the 2-degree target being tabled at the time would spell disaster for Caribbean countries and their way of life. This was confirmed by the science that informed the special IPCC 1.5 report, to which Caribbean scientists contributed through a special study that examined the likely impacts of a 1.5-degree warmer world would have on Caribbean countries and their inhabitants. The study showed conclusively that a 2-degree warmer world is not an acceptable option for the Caribbean. The region, since 1997, has been building capacity to cope with the challenges of climate change and to define the risks arising from a changing climate, understanding the vulnerabilities of and impacts on the region's socioeconomic sectors, the physical environment and population, and designing response measures to mitigate those impacts. We have established a regional climate center as far back as 2005, with a mandate to provide the knowledge base for decision-making on adaptation and to coordinate regional action for effective response to climate change. We've developed a regional strategy for building climate resilience and an accompanying implementation plan, which was recently revised. These provide guidelines for regional and national adaptation action. The region was the first to access the Special Pilot Fund for Adaptation to Climate Change, a facility set up under the Global Environmental Facility, and to implement adaptation projects as far back as 2009. All countries have in place the institutional arrangements to address climate change and have been involved in preparing all the reports required by the UNFCCC, building national capacity, developing national climate change policies, and most recently, revising and updating their country NDCs. I mentioned earlier that our priority is on adaptation, but though the region's contribution to the global greenhouse gas budget is minuscule, all are committed to zero carbon energy sector, as reflected in the NDCs, and phasing out of the use of fossil fuel in the sector. There is, however, a very compelling case for this when one considers that the region is one of the most energy-intensive regions in the world, and a fossil fuel-based energy sector is not a viable option. The mitigation umbrella of climate change provides an avenue for effecting this much-needed transformation. At the recently concluded COP in Glasgow, CARICOM ministers with responsibility for climate change called urgently for unswerving global solidarity to deliver ambition, timely action, and support for a just transition this decade, with the aim of limiting global warming to well below 1.5 degrees centigrade. They called upon leaders, especially the G20 leaders, to close the emissions gap in order to maintain global warming to well below 1.5 degrees and to deliver well before the global stocktake in 2023 new NDCs with 2030 targets that are consistent with the 1.5 degrees centigrade temperature goal and credible net zero by 2050 long-term and credible net zero by 2050 long-term strategies. Of interest to the region, they also call for the provision of fair and just compensation for ecosystem services regarding climate and atmospheric regulation. On the question of climate finance, CARICOM members call for more rapid access to climate finance through the implementation of improved modalities of access and simplified approval procedures, and the employment of innovative financial arrangements, such as debt for climate swaps. To close the finance gap, they call on developed countries to deliver on their goal of at least US 100 billion per annum by 2020, which we realize is a drop in the bucket when compared to the funds we really need for adaptation. Aiming for a balance between mitigation and adaptation, and to progressively scale up finance from the floor of US $100 billion per annum. They also call for a specific target to significantly increase finance for SIDS in accordance with our needs and modalities for fast-track financing, in keeping with the emergency we face. Most importantly, they call for access to climate finance as grants, especially for adaptation and other concessionary instruments on affordable terms, bearing in mind the lender's responsibility not to undermine a country's debt sustainability, and also to provide dedicated funds, additional to the US $100 billion per annum floor, to support the Caribbean and other states to proactively respond to loss and damage already being incurred. The question of finance is critical. In the Caribbean, as in most of our developing countries, we have a pretty fair knowledge of the interventions we need to make under the adaptation umbrella. We have studied, we've done vulnerability assessments, we've done impact studies, we've looked at adaptation options, cost-benefit analysis of these options, and we are ready to implement. But we do not have the funds for implementation. We have developed NAPAs, NDCs, etc., but so far, these are just expressions of intent. And I totally agree with our last speaker that we need to transform our NDCs into portfolios of implementable projects. The science tells us that we do not have the time. But when we look at the processes involved in accessing finances, there seems to be a disconnect between the donor community and the science. We have to jump through all sorts of loops before you get the first disbursement. We have had a project on coral reefs, a critical ecosystem in the Caribbean, for coral reef restoration, submitted since 2015 with one funding agency. And up to now, we have not had 1 cent in disbursement. We have not even had an agreement for implementation. So the message we want to get over is that time is the essence. We are running out of time. If we look at Holland, country with resources, they have the resources to put in place a flood mitigation system for a 1 in 1,000-year event. The Thames flood mitigation system, the same. And you in New York are now thinking of a flood mitigation system that runs into billions of dollars. We in developing countries, and I'm sure I speak for my brothers and sisters in Africa, we do not have the resources to mitigate a yearly event, which we are now experiencing as a result of the increased frequency in extreme events. So resources. It's a myth basically to say that we don't have the knowledge as to what we need to do, but certainly in countries pressed with other priorities for social, for health system, for education system, we do not have the wiggle room to divert resources to climate change, resilience building. And we neglect doing this at our peril. So this is what I want to share with you. I think we have a lot in common with our brothers and sisters in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Trotz. That was a wonderful presentation, an eye-opening presentation. I'm wondering if you have access to the CARICOM report from the CARICOM ministers at Glasgow. If you could share that, if not now,
Yes.
subsequently, yeah, send us the
I
link
would.
so that we can post that on the Seaside website, because I would really like to read that.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. And
We do have a declaration which I'll share with you.
okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
So it seems that there's a lot of complementarity between the three presenters, the three panelists. And you know, the one thing I'd like to ask, and then I would like for you to engage one another, but I do have a question of just for purposes of clarification. This $100 billion, all three of you have referred to this $100 billion that developed nations pledged to give to developing nations, was supposed to be in the hands of developing nations by last year. And this is supposed to be afforded every year. Obviously, that did not take place. What is the mechanism for that money? Is that money is there a clear agreement among the developing nations that each member state will contribute X amount per annum? And then how is that money to be conveyed to developing nations? I mean, is it given to nations individually? How does that work? How is it supposed to work?
I don't think there has been much thought about the modalities, for the collection of those funds, much less for the distribution of the funds. One would suspect that, as usual, they would be channeled through, well, for the convention, there's the Green Climate Fund, there's the Adaptation Fund. There are other funds under the UN system and the international financial organizations. But we are very concerned, as I said, about the access to these funds once they're approved. There is so much iteration between the donor and the client, asking for a whole set of information, and in some cases information that's not really available in our countries. Certainly we don't have the critical studies, etc. But what we are arguing is that, look, we have the experience. We're going through the experience of a change in climate. We know what we need to do to deal with our present day experience and those we predict in the future. So the sort of yardstick that you'll use with a highly developed country, you need to take into consideration the fact that at our level, we cannot provide that foolproof sort of information that would allow you to go ahead with funding. There needs to be some concessionary type of attitude when dealing with issues related to developing countries.
So it sounds, Dr. Trotz, it sounds like what you're saying is that there will be these, there will be a kind of, there will be several funding mechanisms to which individual nations apply for, are expected to apply, but they have to meet certain criteria in order to get these funds.
Yes, that's the modality.
Okay. And Ms. Mbote or Dr. Bassey, what is there, what is there, does the African Union play any role in mediating access to these funds?
I think that to start, first of all, on this whole issue of funds, since the beginning of the environmental agreements in Rio, there has been establishment of funds, like there's the Global Environment Facility. And this is accepting that developing countries have particular challenges and they need to have resources. But I think in the space of climate, it was a climate fund was anticipated to be established, and that would be what would help countries in meeting their obligations under their obligations under the Paris Agreement. And of course, this again is recognizing that countries that have very little resources are the ones that are very burdened by climate change. And I think what Dr. Trotz is saying is important, that we shouldn't have hindrances to access to funds, because for many countries, this is a life and death situation. So the failure to agree to mechanisms that take into account the conditions for the countries, I think that that's problematic. That even if the money is put somewhere, access to that money may be on terms that actually don't meet the requirements, or don't meet they don't meet the need that they've been put in place for.
Thank you, Ms. Mbote. Dr. Bassey, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And thanks for the presentation, Professor Trotz and Professor Mbote. Now, I think one of the big problems about the fund is not about who would have access to the funds, but rather the problem is that the rich industrialized nations are not willing to put the money on the table. They actually want to, there have been problems about offering money as loans and double counting money that would have been offered already is being double counted as money for climate finance because they want to keep back the money. Then they use it as, I think they use it as a bargaining chip to weaken the agreements and then to have the upper hand at every time. Whereas this should be something completely different, because with climate finance that would help to build resilience and help the adaptation in vulnerable nations, would eventually help everybody. It will slow down the number of climate refugees who have to move to somewhere else if they have habitable territories and nations. But I think because of the power play is such that the rich nations are used to exploiting, of subtracting, of taking away, and they don't want to give anything back.
You know, one of the things that I am hearing here, and of course I'm not a scientist, so I'm not positioned to really assess, but you know, based upon the presentations and the little that I do understand, it seems that the experts in the regions, in the Caribbean, in the African continent, you're well aware of what needs to be done with respect to adaptation, mitigation, so forth. I mean, it really raises the question as to whether you're being heard, so, you know, what you said, Dr. Trotz, Ms. Mbote, Dr. Bassey, makes eminent sense to me. And in Dr. Bassey's presentation, he had very, very specific recommendations as to how to move forward. And so, you know, you're involved in various enterprises, various initiatives, endeavors. Is the situation that the scientists in the Caribbean, in the African continent, are just simply not being heard? And how, how can we, what can we do so that you are heard?
You want to take that one up, Mbote?
It's interesting when somebody says we're not being heard, because if you look at discussions from Copenhagen, it was clear that these resources were needed. And maybe if they had been availed, we may have taken some steps to halt the increases in temperature that is now going to, we are far from meeting the 1.5 limit. But I think one of the reasons is the contention of how do you compute 100 billion. And I think that's what Dr. Bassey was saying, that countries want to sort of bandy everything together so that the mark of 100 billion is reached quickly. Not remembering, I think in all the presentations, the three presentations, we've talked about the kinds of other problems that the countries are dealing with. So if we are going to be dealing with climate, there is the question of, is it new and additional funding, rather than banding it together with loans, grants, and whatever had been given before. And we participate in the forums where these issues are discussed. Of course, the question of whether the voice of the Africans and Caribbean states is as loud as the voice of others is something that we can discuss. But we are there, and I think the case has been made for the importance of this money getting where it's needed.
Yes, anyone else? Otherwise, I will go to the Q&A. We have a question from Professor Ofera Davis. So I'll read it. It says, thank you for this great panel. Question for Ms. Mbote and others. Thank you for your excellent analysis of what is happening and is not happening to help the people of Africa, the people in Africa and the global South. Question 1, can you talk about women's work to do the right thing as we move forward and elaborate the urgency of one of the 5 points you gave during your talk? 2, how can women disaster scholars work collaboratively with you to get those with the finances, the $100 billion, to do the right thing to help the people, and mostly important, women at the bottom, so that we can all continue the great work of Wangara and environmental science scholar Philomeno Steady? Thank you for organizing the event. Okay, yes. Would anyone like to take, I think this is directed to you, Ms. Mbote, and then Drs. Trotz and Bassey can also respond.
I think one of the things that we see in the African continent, when you talk about environmental policies, the disjunct between the people who are very active and the people that are making the policies. And so you will have policies on environment that actually totally ignore women. That is a historical thing that we've had. And I'm happy to say that even my career as a law professor, there is anything I'm proud about, is to have contributed in a small way to getting the work of women now featured in environment and in environmental discourses. Because at a point we were seeing a parallel, women's rights and women's work, women's rights and environment moving on parallel tracks. And when you try to bring them together, people saw them as competing agendas. But now, if you look at even the work of the United Nations Environment Program, where I now work, there is quite a lot of emphasis on the importance of bringing women's work to the table. So you will see actually even in an area as technical as climate change, there are very, very active networks of women's engagement. And that was not always the case. So I can, when I want to give, I mean, to be discouraged, I just look at what was happening in 2006 and what is happening now. And I can see that we have made quite a lot of, we've made a lot of ground, we've covered a lot of ground. And when you look at people like Wangari Maathai, Wangari Maathai, who was the Nobel laureate from Africa, really inspired many of us. And you see, she was just doing work of protecting and natural resources, forests, from destruction or conversion to other uses by the powerful. And what we now see, actually, even at the UN level, with the UN resolution 1325, the role of women in conflict resolution is recognized. And on the African continent, you can't talk about the role of women without considering the work that women do as environmental managers. So increasingly, the paths are meeting and people are seeing the creative force of bringing discourses such as environmental conservation and management and women's work, and also bringing in issues of disaster and the engagement of women in these spaces.
Ms. Mbote, you mentioned, you made reference to networks, I believe in the African continent with respect to women's work. Do those networks extend from Africa to the Caribbean, possibly Latin America? Are those transatlantic networks, or are they confined to the continent? And you know, what would be the way forward in order to? I would imagine there is interest in transatlantic networks.
Actually, the networks are global.
Okay.
And once they start at the global, then there is a sense in which you have global and then you have local. And for me, the interesting thing is when all these come together. I think if you look at the development of the environmental movement, a lot of it didn't look at women's agency. It looked actually at, especially on the African continent, you were looking at women are the ones that are causing environmental degradation because they are the ones who are collecting firewood to cook. So they were really either victims of environmental degradation or villains, but increasingly you have the portrayal of African women as people with agency. And in the area of climate change, they can actually, they are seen as a critical force in climate change mitigation and adaptation.
Okay. Dr. Bassey or Dr. Trotz, would you have any comments on what has been said thus far? Otherwise, we can move forward.
Just to say that the role of women basically in climate change responses, etc., has become a very prominent feature of work throughout the donor agencies. As a matter of fact, one, in terms of preparing a proposal, one has to address the gender issue and the sort of participation of women. Here in the Caribbean, in any case, we do have very progressive women NGOs and women sort of activists at the forefront of action, especially under the wider environmental umbrella. And as a region too, the gender issue basically hasn't been as critical as it might have been in some other parts of the globe. Or women have always been at the forefront of change and advocacy. And just last night, one of our countries assumed republic status, moving away from the British government. And the prime minister is the dynamic minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, a woman. And the new president is also a woman. So I think we are in good stead as far as the participation of women is concerned. And we realize that they are critical to the work we are doing there. Without them, we basically wouldn't be making the progress that we are trying to make. So we espouse the whole philosophy of gender equality as far as involvement in the decision making, in the implementation, everything to do with responding to climate change.
You know, it's
Just add to that.
yes, please, Dr. Bassey.
Right. Just to say that oftentimes when we talk about climate change, it's always about the molecules of carbon in the atmosphere. And we pay little attention to the supply side of those molecules where they come from the ground. And my experience with women activism is that they are very central to keeping the carbon in the ground because they suffer the impact of the pollution that comes from the use of extraction of coal, of gas, and of crude oil. They also are the ones who suffer the impact of living close to fossil fuel refineries. And so women are really the ones organizing the standing up in direct actions. And they're also developing innovative adaptation techniques. Women groups in communities and in NGOs, for example, in the Niger Delta, which is one of the 10 top most polluted places in the world, women are engaging in regenerating the mangrove forest. A mangrove forest capture about four times more carbon than other tree species. And they are really helping also to regenerate the fisheries and local economies without being given the required, without being applauded recognized for what they're doing. That's the challenge, to get them to elevate the work of women and really get them in the driving seat to get the action that is needed.
Thank you, Dr. Bassey. Our time is winding down, and I think I want to take another question from the Q&A, but also I do have a kind of query that perhaps we can get to, and the three of you can respond to as we conclude our discussion today. But I'm, given what has been said by the three of you, three excellent presentations, I'm left in a bit of a quandary, and I'd like to know, how should I understand Glasgow? Did it make progress? Should I be encouraged? Are we moving in the right direction? I'm very concerned about this 1.5 Celsius temperature rise benchmark, because it sounds to me that the three of you are in agreement that this is totally inadequate with respect to the global South. And so I'm left to wonder, what does this really mean? But let me take this question from the Q&A from Safia Hasselhuber. My apologies if I did not pronounce your name correctly. Thank you for all of these valuable perspectives, which should be at the forefront of climate talks right now. I would like to ask, is continued reference to the Paris Agreement productive? It seems, at least to me, to be complicit in pushing the timeline of climate change action further and further back. Would anyone like to take that question?
Maybe I could
let me jump in on this. I understand your perspective. As far as we are concerned, the Paris Agreement basically doesn't remember that that agreement was thrashed out before the 1.5-degree study, which we as developing countries had pressed for. What the 1.5 study tells us is that basically this business as usual scenario that we're seeing at this point in time leads to disaster. If there is no compulsion, no time bound in terms of the rate and extent of decarbonization. What has happened recently is that we have realized that if we don't get significant action by 2030, we are now time bound, so that the Paris Agreement doesn't provide us with the action program. It doesn't lead to the action program that is required in this new scenario. We are running out of time, and we need to ramp up ambition. We need to have, and we focus on the mitigation side of the coin, which is critical. But for us to, in developing countries, we have to make sure that the resources are available for us to start to build the climate resilience. We have to be investing as heavily in adaptation as the entire globe is investing on mitigation. Both would have to go hand in hand. So yes, the Paris Agreement as it stands is hopelessly inadequate in terms of defining the action that we need to take to get to the 1.5 ceiling by if you're to get to that 1.5 ceiling. There's action between now and 2030 that is critical. The Paris Agreement does not push us in that direction. So we need to, well, we have revisited it. We've seen glimmers of hope, but as yet, not the type of commitment and action that would be required to get us there.
Thank you, Dr. Trotz. And would anyone else like to respond to that? We have a query in the chat room that I can get to. Greetings from Samania, Ghana, from Tracy Fleming. What role can African-centered approaches to environment and sustainable development play in aligning African worlds? Would anyone like to take that question?
I could take that.
Yes.
In my presentation, I talked about the fact that in most African countries, you have plural legal systems. In Ghana, I know, as in many other African countries. And what we probably have not done is to harvest the wealth of approaches to sustainable environmental management that exist in these not formal spaces, like how have people managed the environment until now. And those would actually be very critical in aligning African worlds, because then you begin to look at what are the things that people have done, for instance, to keep the wildlife there, or to keep the water flowing in different parts of Africa, if you're dealing with, or even what are the different traditional ways of managing when countries are handling floods. That, I think, would be a very good way. I think we as African scholars, and even the Caribbean scholars, need to bring the alternative narratives that are not in the mainstream. Because when we just look at the mainstream, we leave out quite a lot of words. Whether you're talking about rules, for instance, there are many, in many African countries where you have shrines, where they say don't destroy them because of reasons X, Y, and Z. You know, when I was talking about faith for Earth, faith is not just a mainstream religion. It is also traditional religions that also help keep particular groves as sacred and therefore help to sequester carbon or even to look after the water courses and water bodies.
I'd like to get to this question from Ms. Thank you so much, Ms. Mbote. I'd like to get to a question in the chat room from Ms. Adesian. I'll read it to you. The way the conversation has been going, it seems that countries that are not in the global South are not committed to help change the trajectory of the issue. So there's this question of commitment. Will Africa and other continents in the global South have to do the heavy lifting to fix this issue? And what does the heavy lifting look like for many financially deprived countries? Compared to the rest of the world, we play a very little part in the current state of the environmental crisis. Would anyone like to, and we're coming up to we're abutting the end of the session, so would any one of you like to respond to this question?
I just say that the heavy lifting, of course, has been saddled on the vulnerable territories and nations and regions, simply because of the balance of power in the world. We see this clearly in terms of the organizing of the multilateral negotiation system, especially the last one that was held in Glasgow was very unequal because some nations on the red coronavirus list couldn't even make it. Some could send only very small delegates, but the fossil fuel industries had 504 delegates right inside the negotiation. So we find that the tilt of power is against the vulnerable. But the hope is that the young ones the young people who are organizing for climate action are very much working together in solidarity from across the world. Young ones in the global north, young ones in Africa, in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, they're all working together. And that is where the hope lies. If the present generation has lost it, we've lost it completely. And it's young ones who could possibly shift the balance of things if they're given a chance and if they're given a future.
Thank you, Dr. Bassey.
Yeah.
Ms. Taylor has a question about, let's see, where is that? She's curious to know if scholars or NGOs are creating a marketing strategy to create buy-in from the various entities. Any one of you like to take that question?
I think scholars are doing their work, and also non-governmental organizations are doing their work. And that is why you have different narratives getting into a very dominant discourse on climate change. I suppose that's why women have come in. That is why you are having other actors. And maybe, I think you asked, should you be encouraged or discouraged? Many people referred to Glasgow meeting as two COPs because there were the people in the meeting rooms, but there were the hundreds and hundreds of women and youth. And I think one of the biggest things that we have seen is youth activism in climate. And if we are looking at intergenerational concerns, that we are old and probably we will be gone, the people we bequeath the world to have bought the narrative and they care that their environment is kept well. So I do see quite a lot of optimism. I am not at all losing hope.
Well, we're at the end of the session. Thank you so much, Ms. Mbote. Dr. Bassey or Dr. Trotz, do you have any final words for our audience?
I would just like to comment briefly on that last question. In terms of marketing, Patricia mentioned about transforming NDCs into investment projects. In terms of marketing, for the mitigation side of the coin, that would be easy because investment in mitigation is a good business investment. Our problem is selling adaptation. Adaptation, the output is usually a public good. And it is really difficult to get the type of private sector engagement that the developed countries tell us to pursue. But for things like looking after rehabilitating mangroves, etc., basically the returns and that aren't as evident as the returns in mitigation. So there are challenges. But certainly we've been very active, and I agree, the youth. We see our youth with new energy, new vigor. You see them globally with the advocacy. And I think that they are basically developing very novel approaches to getting this type of investment.
Thank you, Dr. Trotz. Dr. Bassey, you have the last word.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the entire conversation. What I notice in the world today, especially with the negotiations, is that nations are tend to think about climate change as national issues and not global issues. It's a time for us to recognize the fact that this is global warming. It's on national warming. So the issue of nationally determined contributions should be jettisoned. We should go back to binding emissions reduction, so that nations know what they got to do according to what they have done historically. And that way we're going to go forward. If we continue to do what is voluntary, what is convenient, and what we can afford to do politically, then the planet will be sunk, if one could say that.
We have exceeded our time for this morning, afternoon, evening. I want to thank Dr. Bassey, Ms. Mbote, Dr. Trotz for your presentations and interventions and contributions to this topic of climate change in the global South. This has been very rewarding, very informative, very alarming. And, I look forward to how we might continue to work together beyond, the forum, if you will, and to see how we might, in fact, join together and work more collaboratively in the effort to mitigate and respond to this challenge of global change. So thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience. I know we lost a few people, but once again, this give us about a week, and this session will be on the CSOD website, and you can access it at that time. So I thank the panelists. I thank the participants. I hope everyone has a pleasant morning, afternoon, evening, and we go forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you.